published a book called All Acts of Love and Pleasure, Inclusive Wicca, which is about including all genders and all sexualities in Wicca. Because although Wicca is very welcoming in terms of ethos towards LGBT and other diversity, it can sometimes seem very heterocentric in its rituals, and it doesn't have to be that way. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the origins of some of those ideas might be and how we can expand those ideas to include everybody. And also just talk about how we can expand the ideas and how we can move on and include everyone. So, first of all, let's talk about some of those awkward moments in Wiccan ritual. The thing at the beginning when we consecrate each other with water and salt or with incense, quite often that's done in such a way that it's usually a man goes around and consecrates all the women, and then a woman goes around and consecrates all the men, which is fine occasionally, but you don't necessarily want to do that all the time. Another one is invocation. We tend to have a man invoking a goddess onto a woman, or a woman invoking a god onto a man. Again, it doesn't have to be that way. Lots of people have done invoking goddesses onto men or gods onto women. You can have same-sex invocation. You can let's experiment and see what the differences in energy really are. Now, this is one of my personal pet hates, and that is this business of making everybody stand male, female, in a circle. A friend of mine was at a Pagan Federation ritual about 2005, and everybody was dancing around in a circle, and he was with his same-sex partner, and he has given me permission to use this anecdote, I might add. He was with his same-sex partner, and it was the first time his partner had actually attended a Pagan Federation event. So there they are, dancing around in a circle, holding hands, and all very romantic, when suddenly this woman appears, jumps in between them, and goes, "Oh, we can't have two men holding hands." Sometimes the boy-girl thing is so heterocentric that it's indistinguishable from homophobia, I think you'll agree. And that is just not on. Then there's cakes and wine, which is again quite often done with a man and a woman. And the symbolism of the shower scene with Amy, well, you get the drift. And sometimes we even have rituals which are entirely organised around the concept of the gender binary, which those of us who don't quite fit in the whole gender binary thing, just sitting there going, well, which side should I be standing? I'm genderqueer, stop it. And it's just quite painful. I go, excuse me, I'm bisexual and genderqueer. I could stand anywhere. And then there's initiations, and the whole subject of whether initiation should be cross-gender or could be same-gender. It will not surprise you to learn that I am a supporter of same-sex initiation. And then even the Wheel of the Year, which if you went to Ronald's fantastic Wheel of the Year talk, you will gather from Ronald's talk that it has everything to do with agriculture and nothing to do with the god and the goddess getting it on around the Wheel of the Year. When I've given similar talks to this in the past, I've had people say some things about what made them uncomfortable about what I said. The one that comes up most often is, but what about tradition? Because, tradition is that it's always being boy, girl, right? And that you need a man and a woman to make a battery and all this stuff, right? No, it hasn't. I tend to point out, one, traditions are fluid and evolving. And then look at all the ancient traditions of gender-variant shamans and sacred sexuality, which included all acts of love and pleasure. And the very thing in the charge that says all acts of love and pleasure, well, that's all acts of love and pleasure, not heterosexual acts of love and pleasure, but all of them. So that seems a bit odd. And then there are so many, if we go back to the source texts of the ancient world, the Greeks and the Romans and the Norse and every other culture, they all had gender-bending deities and same-sex love among deities. So the whole being inclusive is not kind of some new thing that was invented in the 21st century. It's more ancient than not being inclusive. So next time somebody says to you, but what about tradition? You can say, well, actually, my inclusive thing is older. So, and I also think that the point that a lot of people seem to think that tradition is somehow a thing that's set in stone and handed down for generations. Well, as we heard from Philip's talk earlier, we know that Wicca evolved out of that small group in the New Forest, and we know that it evolved over the first few years of Gardner and Doreen Valiente getting together and doing stuff. And actually, if you go back to the source texts of Wicca, you can see evolution as we go along through the festivals and people invent new stuff. It's only at some point in maybe this 1970s or 80s that people start going, okay, we're going to draw a line and say, because now we've got a lot of text, maybe we don't want to have to copy lots of extra text out by hand. Oh, let's draw a line there and say, well, that stuff is traditional, and this stuff is new. But actually, again, if you look at the older Wiccan texts, there's nothing about this standing boy, girl in a circle stuff, or you must only invoke a god to a man and a goddess unto a woman. It's all a bit more fluid than that. I mean, obviously, we know that Gerald Gardner was homophobic, sadly, but he ain't Jesus. Gerald Gardner is not the Wiccan Jesus. So we can say, yeah, okay, he lived in the 1950s. That was quite a prevalent attitude back then. We've moved on. Get over it. And so everywhere you look, if you look at any anthropological study of cultures and how they evolve and change, you will see that culture and tradition evolve and change all the time. The notion that tradition is somehow fixed is just utter rubbish. And just go and read any anthropological study of anything and you will see, they will say, like, this tradition evolved. I guess we get the notion that tradition is somehow set in stone from the late 19th, early 20th century, when the folklorists were going around collecting all the folklore, and they kind of went to the remotest country spots because that's where they thought that the traditions would have evolved the least, and said, oh yes, these are like cultural fossils that have been preserved, like flies in amber or like fossils in a bedrock. And so they were looking for something that hadn't evolved, and that's probably where we get the idea that tradition doesn't evolve, but it does. And in fact, the very fact that they were ignoring what was going on in the towns and focusing on what went on in the countryside shows us that tradition is a fluid and evolving thing. Because as soon as people come into contact with each other, there's an explosion of creativity and people do interesting stuff and they change what they do. So, that's tradition out of the way then. I mean, obviously, old stuff is good and we like old stuff and it's good to preserve it. But if it's broken and if it doesn't work, then let's change it. It's like the institution of marriage. The tedious bigots who opposed same-sex marriage were like, yes, but you're changing the definition of marriage. And what about tradition? And you go, well, look, there was divorce that was introduced for everybody in the 1930s, and then the whole notion of companionate marriage completely changed the definition of marriage. Divorce changed the definition of marriage.
Britney Spears changed it.
Yes. And also, obviously, contraception massively changed the definition of marriage, because suddenly you could have sex without the inevitable consequence of getting bulgy. And so, like, marriage is a tradition, but you can see how that's evolved. And now, hurrah, it's evolved to include more people, which is great. For me, the way it works is that basically, if a tradition works, we keep it. If it doesn't work, because the thing is, the reason traditions happen is because people discover a thing that works, and then they go, oh, that's good, I'll do that some more, and then I'll teach it to the next people. So when it arrives, if somebody gives you something and says, well, this is a tradition, you go, okay, well, great. Does it work? It's nice that it's a tradition, but if it doesn't work for me, I'm going to have to adapt it. And that's how traditions evolve. And I think, I'm not saying let's dismiss all the traditions, because one of the three things about Wicca that strike me as particularly liberating and powerful are scourging, which a lot of people are uncomfortable with, nakedness, working skyclad, and working magic. Now, all of those things are things that some people might be uncomfortable with. And I think that what's key about those things is that they are empowering, and that's why they work. You can always think of examples where somebody's going to be uncomfortable with one of those things, but usually it's not like a whole class of people. So but generally speaking, we know that working skyclad is empowering for a lot of people. Scourging, very transformative thing. A lot of people find that uncomfortable and go, no, I can't go there. But neither of those things discriminates against a whole group of people. Whereas if you say, okay, polarity only works between a man and a woman, then you are excluding a whole bunch of people when you don't need to be, because there are many more things that can achieve polarity. But another really interesting objection that was raised when I gave this talk recently was, but you leave, when you come into the circle, you leave your personal stuff outside, right? And I didn't know what to do with that. I was just gobsmacked. I was like, how does that work? I mean, when I come before the pagan gods and goddesses and genderqueer deities, I'm like, it's all of me. I'm bringing my whole self. So the notion that you leave any aspect of your identity, whether it's political or sexual or whatever, outside of the circle, seems really, really odd and alien to me. It seems like some kind of weird, non-pagan thing. But it was an interesting question because it sort of just hadn't thought of it before. But to me, when I come before the gods, I bring me, my whole self, my sexual identity, my politics, my green awareness, everything is with me in the circle. The idea that we kind of leave our gender or our sexuality or anything else, any other aspect of our identity outside of the circle just seems really odd to me. You're all looking puzzled, so I'm taking it that you agree with me. But it was an interesting question. And I thought of that quote, the personal is political, and the political is personal as well, isn't it? And I just found it very odd. So, I just wanted to, and I said, well, do heterosexuals leave their identity when they enter the circle? I don't know. One of the problems that it strikes me in Wicca is that we have a rather antiquated notion of how gender works, okay? And that is the gender binary. So we tend to have goddesses who are a bit kind of floaty and pretty and not warriors and they're floaty and pretty. And then we have sort of wild men of the woods as our representations of gods. And you get books, you get esoteric books with lists. I found this list on the internet of feminine qualities. So a list of feminine qualities which includes the moon and the earth, passive, yin, water, earth, receptive, nurturing, intuitive. Okay. And we have masculine qualities, sun, sky, active, yang, fire, air, penetrating, warlike, intellectual. And I'm sure, we all know women who are intellectual, and we all know men who are nurturing, don't we? So the notion that those qualities are somehow magically divided between the sexes, we know that isn't right. Okay? So, love isn't about gender, and magic isn't about gender. So, let's talk through some of the ideas that inform this notion of the gender binary and deconstruct them a bit. So one of the things is this notion of biological sex, that there are male people and female people. Okay, then what about all the intersex people? The thing that makes you male, you have 7 different sexual characteristics that make you male, and I think there are 7 different sexual characteristics that make you female. I'm not a biologist, so I can't remember what they all are, but some people who are classed as female don't have all of those biological characteristics, and some people who are classed as male don't have them all. And as we all know, there are people with anomalous chromosomes. So there are people, there are various different intersex people who try, and when they're born, the doctor's trying to kind of force them into the box of male and the box of female, and quite often they just get it really badly wrong, and quite often those people are the ones who want to have a sex change later in life. So wouldn't it be better to leave them alone until they can make up their own minds? So this notion that biological sex is binary is just not true, and it's harmful trying to force people into those boxes by cutting bits off them. And actually the notion of having 2 separate biological sexes is socially constructed. Okay, so that's your biological sex. Let's think about your gender identity. So your gender identity can be how are you feeling in your head. You know, do you feel male, or do you feel female, or do you feel genderqueer? So a mixture or neither. So your gender identity and how you perform that gender is determined by your upbringing, by society, by whatever norms prevail at the time, and to some extent perhaps by your biological sex as well, because some people have a lot of their physical characteristics match what's in their head. That's what we call cisgender, which just means this side of the divide, or the same side of the divide, and people whose gender identity in their head doesn't match their biological characteristics, that's what we call transgender. So apparently a lot of people who are cisgender get really upset about the term cisgender. Well, it just means the same gender identity as your biological designated sex. So, I don't actually get why people find that insulting. So, and then a third layer, obviously, is sexual orientation. So, within sexual orientation, we can think about that as a spectrum from asexuality to full attraction. And if you're bisexual, you can be somewhere along the spectrum of attraction to men, and somewhere along the spectrum of attraction to women. Obviously, if you're heterosexual, you'll be somewhere along the spectrum of attraction to one or the other. And actually, I added a third spectrum, which is attraction to people who don't exhibit strongly male or strongly female. Because I thought, wow, hang on, yeah. Otherwise, if I have 2 arrows, that's a bit binary. So let's have another. Right. So. My lovely friend Morgana, gives away Morgana, came up with this marvellous thing, which, not being very occulty, I didn't know about, called the 7 Hermetic Principles, of which there are 7. It's like the wise woman, she's wise and a woman. Right, so anyway, the first one is mentalism, which is the power of thought, as you might imagine. Correspondence is the second one. So that's the idea that everything corresponds with everything else. Vibration, the idea that everything in the universe vibrates. Polarity, which we're going to go into a bit more in a minute. rhythm, so the idea that everything moves to a rhythm, cause and effect, that you have a cause and an effect, and finally gender. And Morgana made the point that a lot of people mix up the law of polarity and the law of gender because they assume that they're the same thing, and they're not. So the principle of polarity is that everything is dual, everything has poles, everything has its pair of opposites. Like and unlike are the same. So even though it's about polarity, there's also a unity in the thing. Opposites are identical in nature but different in degree. So think about light and dark, love and hate. They're opposite to each other, but they're both, like love and hate are both emotions, and light and dark are an absence of light versus light. Extremes meet. I think that's important. All truths are but half-truths, and all paradoxes may be reconciled. So that is the principle of polarity as laid out in the Kybalion, which was a Hermetic text from the 3rd century.
No, it's not clear, but it's written by the initiate.
Right, so it's old stuff. Right, so this idea that, you need a man and a woman to make polarity, it's much more complicated than that. Okay, and then the principle of gender. Gender is in everything. Everything has its masculine and feminine principles. Everything has. That implies that they're both present in everything, in different degrees of mixture. And gender manifests on all planes. Now that I find interesting because Dion Fortune said that where women are, it's a little bit sexist, but this is what she said. Women are passive in the world, but active on the magical plane. And men are active in the world, but passive on the magical plane. So the roles are switched. So even though we might not like that particular approach, even back then in the 30s and 40s, there was a more complex approach to gender in that the roles were switched on the inner planes. Okay. So, the most important thing I want to say about polarity is that you don't need two different genders to make poles. You definitely get different polarities involving all sorts of different mixtures of qualities. So, light and dark, I said air and earth, fire and water. You can even have smoke versus mud. You can have the mixtures of the mixture of air and fire is smoke, and the mixture of earth and water is mud. And you could have smoke and mud as a polarity, which would make for a really interesting ritual. You could say, right, okay, in astrology, there's also the notion of triplicity, which is where, as a Cancer, I am a cardinal sign. And if you are a Gemini, that means you are a mutable sign, and then if you're a Scorpio, that's a fixed sign. And there are there are 4 fixed signs, and they form a equal on cross on the astrological zodiac wheel. And there are 4 mutable signs and 4 cardinal signs. And the thing about cardinal signs is we start projects. We don't finish projects. Okay, I've just finished writing a book, but it took me 20 years. So I start things, I poke things and see what happens. But I don't finish things. I couldn't organise a conference like this because I just wouldn't have the confidence. But I start things and poke things. And fixed signs, they're the people who actually turn up to committees year after year, they're brave souls, and actually get the stuff done. And then mutable signs are, I haven't quite worked out what it is mutable signs do, but they are very lovely. Yeah, I think they're like they're the fluid that makes everything move.
Yeah.
That's it.
Make a lot of wind.
Yes.
What do you want to add, Brussels sprouts?
Well, yes, there you go. So, another notion that gets talked about a lot is this notion of fertility. It's an interesting thing that in the Grail legends, it's a male knight who asks the question, the right question of the king. So the king is lying wounded in his thigh, which I think is a euphemism for his penis. So the king is lying wounded and he's bleeding, and there's a maiden staunching his wounds. And then the Grail Knight comes and asks the right set of questions. And it's asking that right set of questions that enables the king to be healed, and therefore the fertility to be restored to the land. So I think, just as you can have two people of the same sex making polarity, you can have two people of the same sex making fertility. Because fertility is not just about making babies. There's fertility of mind, the creativity of the mind. There's the fertility of the spirit, the renewal of joy. And those things are really, really important. There's a wonderful queer writer called Christian de la Huerta who wrote a thing about the 10 queer spiritual roles. And those 10 queer spiritual roles are all about being a catalyst and a transformer and a healer and a shaman and a bringer of energies from other dimensions, and the fool and the trickster who brings new life and new energy. And those things are really important. And actually, if we look at nature and we look at animals, same-sex animals in nature, sorry, you know what I mean, same-sex behaviours in nature, that nature has a wonderful way of having, for instance, two female kittiwakes and a male kittiwake on the nest, brooding over the eggs. And lesbian kittiwakes, they're little birds that nest on cliffs, and they're lesbians. It's awesome. I mean, seriously, if you want your mind blown, just go on Wikipedia and look at all the list of gay animals. It's brilliant. Like warthogs, gay warthogs. Amazing. So anyway, the notion that fertility is somehow restricted to heterosexuals just seems awfully biologically reductionist to me, and that we should have a much more expanded notion of fertility, and think about creativity and the creation of beauty, because those things are really important, and without those things we wouldn't have the joy and the fertility of spirit that we have now. So, polarity. One of the things that it embodies polarity in Wicca is the consecration of the wine. And the very wonderful author Lina Langstreet, who is a Canadian lesbian woman, wrote a beautiful piece called Revisioning Polarity, or What's a Nice Dyke Like You Doing in a Polarity-Based Tradition Like This? And she talks about that, a man and a woman getting it on, or a penis and a vagina. Okay, those things are expressions of polarity, but they are not the ultimate form of polarity. They're just symbols of the ultimate polarity. And what she sees as the ultimate polarity is the moment when the lightning struck the primeval sea to create the first living organism. And that's what the image that she sees when the Athame touches the wine. A beautiful image. The lightning striking the primeval sea to create the first living organism. Well, that was some lightning and some water. It didn't involve penises and vaginas, it's a primordial thing. And I quite often do cakes and wine and talk about that image before I do the cakes and wine. I do highly recommend her article. It's really, really good. And if you have bought the book, there's the full reference to the article in the book. So, polarity, as we've seen earlier, it can be a combination of all sorts of different opposites. It doesn't have to be merely male and female. Another sort of ultimate polarity is spirit and matter, the union of spirit and matter. And neither of those things has a gender either. So I think again, when we talk about these things, we're not sort of saying, oh, throw the baby out with the bathwater and ignore the heterosexuals. We're just saying, look at all the other symbols we could be using apart from that one thing. By all means, let's celebrate heterosexual love and same-sex love and everything. Because if we say, oh, we're never going to celebrate heterosexual love, no, because that would be exclusive as well. I mean, I had somebody on my Facebook the other day who said, oh, you know, where I live, if you do any sort of expression of heterosexuality in ritual, people complain. And I was like, really? I find it's the other way around, actually. There you go. But you know, let's not throw the whole heterosexual stuff out the window and get rid of it. But you know, like, hello, queer people exist. Hello. And when we actually look at the sources of the Wiccan tradition and where it all comes from in terms of folklore and mythology and what people got up to in the past, there's an abundance of queerness in it. There's the tradition of Seidra in the northern tradition, of heathenry, where you have the idea of heating things up and creating energy and creating it in a cauldron. So clearly a source of Wiccan imagery, or witchcraft imagery, but this was often done by men who were gender variant. So it was done by women, but it was also, when a man engaged in Seidra, he was seen as gender variant because he had been penetrated by the gods. So he was now ergi. Now the meaning of ergi is disputed, but it does, the sources indicate that people saw a man who practiced Seidra as ergi and therefore penetrated by the gods. So obviously one of the key things about having a penis is that generally you stick it into things rather than having one stuck into you. So for a man to actually open himself and be receptive to something is often seen in historical cultures as being somehow odd. Obviously it's not, but it does change the perception of the man about his body image and how his body exists in a physical space. And that's a really interesting thing, and it does, it's certainly a big part of a lot of spirituality where men talk about having been penetrated by the gods. Even in Christianity you get, Yahweh is hyper-masculine and everybody else is feminine in relationship to Yahweh. Odin, when Odin was initiated by Freya, Odin was then seen as somehow female. We also have the Spey wives of the medieval tradition who were clearly the inheritors of the whole Seidra thing. And in Wicca, some people talk about Dryton, both male and female, the original source of all things. And it seems to me that Dryton is a divine androgyne. And so that's why I wanted the picture of the divine androgyne on the cover of my book. Joan of Arc, right, who was actually burnt as a witch as well as a heretic, had a same-sex relationship with another woman, tended to dress up as a man, as we know, and was regarded in a negative light by her contemporaries for dressing up as a man and having relationships with women. And when you go back to Gerald Gardner's books about witchcraft, he talks about how Joan of Arc girded on the sword, and thus that's why she became a leader, and that's why she was a witch. So again, gender bending in right there in the heart of the tradition. And then when you actually examine queer spirituality, which I did for my MA dissertation, you find that a lot of the key themes are about darkness and nature and receptivity. And those are key themes in Wicca, that we receive energies and inspiration from the gods. We like to do it in the dark. We're very keen on the moon, and we're very keen on nature. So there's a big overlap between queer spirituality and the themes in Wicca. So how can we create rituals that are more inclusive? like I showed you, we can make magic with different polarities. We can do the consecrations at the beginning of the ritual. You could have, for instance, you could have all the ginger-haired people consecrating all the light-haired people consecrating all the dark-haired people. Or you could have, you have all the LGBT people consecrating the straight people. Or, or you could do the thing we did with the different elements. You could do all sorts of different sort of contrasts and see what works for you. A lovely idea that I was told very recently, rather than saying, right, okay, you are always receptive or you are always active, have a check-in at the beginning of the ritual to say, are you feeling receptive today or are you feeling transmitting today? And so all the transmitters are, those who transmit energy, and all the receivers are the ones who receive, and they stand alternate transmitter, receiver, transmitter, receiver. Personally, I'd have trouble with that as well, because I'm like, transmitting or receptive, I'm not sure. But it's an interesting idea. We can do rituals that illustrate gender diversity by having different, like a woman invoking on another woman, or the other things we've talked about. One of the things that you can do if you have a lot of people is form an arch where you have different pairs in the arch, so like maybe a lesbian couple and a gay couple and a bisexual couple and some polyamorous people and whatever other variations you think of, get them to form an arch, and then each pair in the arch goes through the rest of the people, and then everybody's gone through this arch, so it's like you're reborn into the circle through an arch of gender and sexual diversity. It's a lovely thing to do. So, cakes and wine, right. This is a thing I invented for cakes and wine in about 1995, where, could I have a lady? Lovely. So if you're probably familiar with the tarot card of Temperance, where there's a woman with 2 cups pouring one into the other. So, so we bless our cup, and then one of us pours, and I pour my cup into your cup. And then you pour your cup into my cup. And thus, your wine is blessed. Feel free to nick it. Oh yeah. Spread it far and wide. Another lovely thing, which I got from a bunch of European Wiccans, is rather than saying as the athame is to the male and the cup is to the female, I have to say that really slowly because I always try to gender bend them, is to say as the athame is to the lover, so the cup is to the beloved. And that includes everyone. So yeah, and why not same-sex initiations? I mean, that's a whole topic which would take a long time, but I support same-sex initiation. There you go. And also, why not a more polytheistic Wheel of the Year? Because the thing about, I'm not trying to convert you all to polytheism, but the thing about polytheism that I really like is that it gives us all manner of deities of different gender and sexual identities to work with. So rather than having a heterosexual god and a heterosexual goddess, you can have a whole panoply of different warrior goddesses, and sun goddesses, moon gods, and genderqueer deities, and the whole wonderful gamut of divine diversity. That is all I have time for, which is lucky because it's the end of the talk. And I think we've probably got a couple of minutes for questions. I will just do another plug for the book, out now from Avalonia Books, All Acts of Love and Pleasure, Inclusive Wicca, by Yvonne Aburrow. It is available for pre-order now, $14.99.